It is not a scream. That single correction, delivered quietly on a film set in New Zealand by an 81-year-old actor dressed as a wizard, is the reason Viggo Mortensen still cannot talk about Christopher Lee without his voice changing. Peter Jackson had asked for a scream. Lee refused to give him one. He asked the director, calmly, whether he actually knew what a man sounds like when a blade goes through his back. Then he answered his own question before Jackson could attempt one. The air is driven out in one short, forced breath, because a punctured back leaves no room for anything louder. Jackson did not push back. He let the scene stand exactly as Lee insisted it be played. Standing a few feet away, absorbing every second of the exchange, was a 43-year-old actor already known for going further than almost anyone else on set to make a role feel real. 2 decades later, at 67, with 3 Academy Award nominations behind him, Viggo Mortensen still returns to that single moment whenever he is asked what Christopher Lee actually meant to him. To understand why that moment carried so much weight, it helps to understand how improbable it was that Mortensen was even standing there to witness it. He was not the original choice to play Aragorn. Irish actor Stuart Townsend had already been cast, had trained for close to 2 months, and had arrived in New Zealand ready to begin shooting. Only days before filming started, Jackson made the difficult decision to recast the role, concerned that Townsend, then 27, read as too young beside castmates playing far older characters, and unsettled by his reluctance to commit to the physical training the part required. Jackson needed a ranger who looked like he had lived a hard life outdoors for decades, not a young leading man learning the part as he went. Mortensen, then in his early 40s, got the call almost by accident. He very nearly said no. He had a young son, Henry, and months of filming on the other side of the world felt like the wrong trade at the wrong moment in his son's life. According to accounts Mortensen has given in interviews over the years, it was Henry who changed his mind, urging his father not to turn down a role from books his son already loved. Mortensen accepted without having read a single page of Tolkien's novels, packed a bag, and was on a plane within days, walking onto set with no rehearsal time and only a vague sense of who Aragorn was meant to become. That lack of preparation showed in his earliest scenes, and it worked strangely in his favor. Aragorn's introduction at the Prancing Pony, where Frodo and Sam wait for a ranger who barely existed in the production days earlier, carries a visible uncertainty that many critics and fans have since pointed to as an accidental strength rather than a weakness. Aragorn himself is a man hiding from his own destiny in those early scenes, uneasy in his own identity, reluctant to be recognized for who he truly is. Whatever hesitation was genuinely present in Mortensen's performance became, almost by chance, exactly the right choice for the character. It did not last as an accident for long. By the confrontation with the ringwraiths at Weathertop, Mortensen had begun making deliberate, unscripted choices, and the widely referenced shot of Aragorn swinging a torch directly toward camera was reportedly improvised in the moment. From there, Mortensen committed to a level of physical realism that has been documented extensively in film press coverage and in Ian Nathan's book on the making of the trilogy, Anything You Can Imagine, Peter Jackson and the Making of Middle-earth. He trained with a real steel sword rather than a lightweight prop, insisting on the weight and balance of an actual weapon. He broke a toe kicking a helmet during a fit of frustration, and let the real reaction make the final cut. He chipped a tooth during the helm's deep shoot, and reportedly sat through a dentist chair still in costume, rather than lose an afternoon of filming. He grew close enough to his horse that he purchased it once production wrapped. Somewhere in the middle of that obsessive commitment, Mortensen found something in Christopher Lee that no amount of personal dedication could manufacture on its own, because it did not come from training. It came from where Lee had actually been. Christopher Lee was born in 1922 in Belgravia, London, the son of an Italian Contessa and a British Army officer, a background already unlike almost anyone else eventually cast in the trilogy. By the time he arrived in New Zealand to play Saruman, he had lived an entire previous life that most of his younger castmates knew almost nothing about. Lee served in the Royal Air Force for the whole of the Second World War and was involved by his own account and by the account of biographer Jonathan Rigby in Christopher Lee, the authorized screen history. In intelligence work he almost never discussed in specific terms even decades later. Producer Barry Osborne, who was present for the death scene conversation with Jackson, later said only that Lee had some connection to British Special Forces or wartime intelligence, an answer vague enough to suggest that even people who worked closely with Lee never learned the full picture, and that Lee, by every account, preferred it stay that way. He spoke several languages fluently, a fact that reportedly surprised many of his collaborators, since Hollywood rarely gave him a chance to use more than one at a time. He had met J.R.R. Tolkien in person years earlier, by his own repeated account, which would make him the only member of the production who had ever actually spoken with the author, and he claimed in interviews to reread The Lord of the Rings every year as a private ritual. He had wanted, quite openly, to play Gandalf, and said so plainly when asked about it later in life. By the time Jackson was casting, Lee was approaching 80, and the physical demands of Gandalf, the writing and the extended fight choreography, were more than his body could reliably deliver. Saruman asked less of him physically, so he took what the role offered and gave it everything he had left. What almost nobody on set realized at the time was how much of that history surfaced in quiet moments between takes, with one particular castmate paying far closer attention than anyone around them noticed. While much of the cast passed downtime playing cards, Mortensen and Lee reportedly found a corner and spoke in German, in Spanish, occasionally in Old Norse, languages neither man had learned for film but had simply always wanted to know. They were not discussing box office numbers or the trilogy's well-documented production troubles. They were discussing the mythological roots Tolkien himself had drawn from, folklore Mortensen already understood before Jackson ever cast him. Lee, according to people who worked on production, found in Mortensen someone rare among younger actors, someone who treated the material as inheritance rather than entertainment. Lee also noticed the sword. Having trained extensively in stage combat over a career that included playing Dracula across 7 Hammer productions and a memorable turn as a Bond villain, Lee reportedly told the production cinematographer that Mortensen carried a natural combative instinct rare in an actor who trains for a role rather than one who already carries it inside from somewhere else. For Mortensen, that comment was not a passing compliment. It was closer to a verdict from the only person on set actually qualified to deliver one. There was warmth underneath the history as well. Lee, despite decades as cinema's most recognizable screen villain, had recorded opera in his youth and would go on, well into his 80s, to record symphonic heavy metal albums simply because the idea appealed to him. He had founded a small press, specifically to publish poetry and photography that would never turn a profit for anyone involved. 2 men who had each built enormous, very different public reputations were quietly pursuing creative work that had everything to do with who they actually were underneath the roles audiences knew them for. That closeness is part of what made his death land as hard as it did. Christopher Lee died on June 7, 2015, in a London hospital, 10 days after turning 93, closing out a life that had spanned 2 entirely different kinds of history, one lived and one performed. Peter Jackson wrote afterward that visiting Lee at his London home with his wife, Git, more than 50 years into their marriage by then, had been one of the genuine pleasures of his own life. Hours spent hearing fragments of stories he knew he would never get the whole of, since Lee had always shared his real history in careful, deliberate pieces offered strictly on his own terms. In the years since, Mortensen has done something that surprised people who assumed he would coast on the trilogy's success. He turned down other major franchise offers, calling much of that work predictable and underwritten, and declined to return as Aragorn for The Hobbit, since the character was not written into that book, and forcing him would have been the kind of compromise he had spent his career avoiding. Instead, he pursued work that was harder and stranger. He made A History of Violence with David Cronenberg in 2005, the first of 4 collaborations between the two, and later called it among the best work of his career. 2 years after that came Eastern Promises, in which he played a Russian mob enforcer. So convincingly, they traveled through Russia, without a translator, and studied the meaning behind specific prison tattoos in obsessive detail, work that earned him his first Academy Award nomination. For The Road, in 2009, adapting Cormac McCarthy's novel, he reportedly lost significant weight and slept in his character's filthy clothes between takes. Captain Fantastic, in 2016, brought a second nomination, and Green Book, in 2018, brought a third, alongside the film's Best Picture win. None of it happened because he needed validation. He already had Aragorn and the security that came with it. He chose the harder path anyway, a pattern that traces back, by his own repeated account in interviews, to one specific man on a New Zealand set who quietly refused to fake something he actually knew the truth of. Mortensen talks about acting, in most interviews, the way people talk about a technical craft, careful and rarely sentimental. But when the subject turns to Christopher Lee, something shifts, and he describes not a colleague, but something closer to a living artifact, a man who carried real history into a story about invented violence and made the fiction more honest than it had any right to be. Aragorn, as written, carries an almost unbearable reverence for the kings who came before him, men whose sacrifices shaped the world he inherited without fully understanding until he was forced to become the thing he had spent his life avoiding. Watching Mortensen's performance with that context in mind, it becomes hard to miss where some of that reverence genuinely came from. The king who came before him in every sense that mattered on that set was standing a short distance away between takes, speaking quietly in a language neither of them needed for the film, carrying memories he would only ever share in fragments, never the whole story, and never to just anyone who happened to ask. At 67, with a celebrated career built on the same relentless commitment Lee modeled for him decades earlier, the thing Mortensen keeps returning to again and again is an old man in a wizard's costume who knew exactly what a knife in the back actually sounds like, and was generous enough to let one underprepared young actor stand close enough to understand what he was witnessing.